Dr. Ella Washington. It's so good to have you on the Transform Your Workplace podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Brandon. Happy to be here.
We're here to talk about your brand new book. It's out. It's called Unspoken, a guide to cracking the hidden corporate code. And, you know, in the introduction, I kind of honed in, you were telling some stories about your mother's experiences and with workplace stressors. And I'm curious, like, how those personal stories and maybe other ones you've heard like it have shaped your approach to workplace dynamics that maybe you experience and other people experience, and how that influenced this book.
Yeah, not even just this book, but as I think about my whole career and why I do this work in the workplace industry to begin with, it's because we spend so much of our lives at work. More than a third of our lives are spent at work or working. And I always tell, my classes that it's more than a third, given the fact that we're all interconnected with social media and the internet and emails all the time, right? And so we think about this good chunk of our lives are spent around work. And the reality is work shouldn't suck, right? It should be an enjoyable part of our lives. Though we may not all have, every day may not be our best day, it should be an enjoyable experience overall. So that's kind of like the crux of my work, because it is personal. And when I think about my mom and how I grew up in a single parent household, and the fact that my mom absolutely loved her career, but often hated her job, that had an impact on me. And for me, my work is centered around making people understand, what would it take for them to be in a work environment where they could thrive, and also helping organizations to understand the same and create those environments.
Own Your Story is the title of your first chapter. And you wrote that, like, who you are outside of work impacts who you are inside of work. And I think for so long, those things have been really separated. And I think you're encouraging people here to own who they are so that they can possibly bring it to work and have more importance and emphasis on what their self-narrative is. How do you think that owning the story ultimately impacts the professional success of people?
Well, who we are outside of work has an impact on how we show up at work, right? So we may not be the same exact people. Like, we talk a lot about bring your authentic self to work, which is a whole different conversation. But you should bring, your professional self, which should be a version of who you are, right? Mm. And if you're not clear on who you are or how your identity has an impact on how you show up, it's really hard for other people to get to know you. It's hard for you to lean into those natural strengths that you have that make you great and unique. And so owning your story and around that self-awareness is really the first step, particularly for people with non-dominant identities. Many people have spent, much of their lives trying to downplay their differences in whatever ways they may show up. And so owning your story is the exact opposite of that. It's understanding how your differences, whether it be your race, your gender, how you grew up, where you grew up, experiences that you had that had an impact on who you are today, all of that rolls into how you show up today. Even if you're not tapping into that on a daily basis, it's part of who you are. It's part of your narrative, right? And the more that we can own that and connect with that, the more that we can be strategic about how we show up at work and find ways to connect with people, hopefully people that are similar to us and different from us as well.
Yeah. I know you've done a ton of work in DEI in the past, and it's sprinkled throughout this book. And I know your other books have emphasized that. And I'm curious, like, in the work that you've done, if you help people identify their story, have self-awareness around it, so they can choose the version of themselves that show up in the professional setting. Because I agree with you. Like, we need to embrace the differences of people. Like, they should own it, and it's special when it's working well inside of an organization and just respecting each other's differences.
Absolutely. I've had so many clients that I've worked with on this topic, from simple things like, you're working in a banking environment and everyone feels like they're from affluent backgrounds, right? And this, is something that really happened. And, I had a client that, talked about, well, they didn't feel like they fit in because they didn't feel like they had the same hobbies as everybody else in the workplace. because they grew up in a poor environment. And so they weren't going to vacation at these, places that everyone has been. And they didn't have the same hobbies that were quite expensive. And so they didn't have that exposure. And so even though they were now all working in the same environment and, thinking they're within the same, type of compensation brackets, the reality is their experience and their identity was still different than a lot of their peers. And so helping them to understand that, the way they grew up can have a positive impact on the lens that they're bringing to their organization. Their organization wanted to diversify their clientele and wanted to understand people's experiences. And part of that was, this person owning their own story. And so I see so many examples of that. And it's not just for the benefit of the organization, right? That is kind of like a byproduct. I think the first benefit is for you understanding your own story so that you can figure out what the best work environment is for you, right? And what type of support that you need, what your goals are. All of that is connected to who you are on the inside.
Dr. Ellie, you emphasize the importance of like recognizing the strengths that we have. And I think for a lot of people, it's hard to identify like what are we really good at and how can we like continue to leverage those strengths to be really successful. So I don't know if you have any tips or ideas on how people can become self-aware of their strengths and possibly even their weaknesses.
Oh, absolutely. Both are important to understand, your strengths and your weaknesses. So in my book, at the end of every chapter, I actually do give some frameworks and some working tips for how people can actually do this in real life. But one thing that I will say is around your strengths is getting feedback, asking for feedback, and not just general feedback like how am I doing? Asking your peers and your managers and other folks that work with you, what do you see in my work that's going really well? Like, what are the things that I'm doing that you want to see more of? And then the opposite, what are the things that I could be improving on? I know the whole feedback conversation is very deep, right? And there's so many things that we can talk about in that regard, but it is about not only getting feedback externally, but also it goes back to that self-awareness. Like, what are the activities that bring you joy? What are the things that energize you instead of drain you? One question I always ask, what are those things that you do and you get lost in time? You forget to eat, or you look up and it's been 3 hours of enjoyment, right? And, not trying to paint a picture where everything that we do at work will be just, so excited and bring us joy. But hopefully, if you're in the right career and your career is aligned with your strengths, you will have those moments of, oh, I really like doing that. I want to do more of those activities. And so those are the things that I would say give you clues of your strength. And only by testing those things will you really understand, okay, yes, this is a strength. This is an area that I can, be at my excellent level more times than not, especially when I invest in those strengths.
What about our weaknesses? Should we ignore those? What do we do with those?
You absolutely should not ignore your weakness, but you should also not spend too much energy there. And so let me explain. When we think about weaknesses, it's all about managing your weakness. So one, you have to be aware that you have a weakness. And using Gallup's definition, a weakness is anything that can get in the way of our success, right? And so if you have a weakness in an area, you can't just ignore it because it could absolutely limit your success in the future. However, what we know from over 70 years of strengths-based development, psychology research, is that for most people, that saying a jack of all trades and a master of none is really a thing, meaning that while many of us grow up in environments where we think we have to be great at everything, or college applications, for example, you got to get A's in every single subject. You have to be president of everything. You have to volunteer at 100 organizations and have 3 jobs and want to save the world, right? That's how a lot of us are trained, if you will. However, once you get into the real world and once you get into your career, you see that, many people are specialists at something, right? Even in the HR world, you may be a generalist, but you know the things that people always come to you for. You know the things that you are contributing, right? And so it's a mindset shift that we have to have, that we don't need to try to be good at everything, but we do need to manage those weaknesses that may hold us back from success. And so management of weaknesses can look like putting structures in place to help you to be better at those things or to get partners. I always say that, an individual doesn't need to be well-rounded, but a team does need to be well-rounded. And so understanding your weaknesses helps you partner with the right folks or put the necessary structures in place, whether it's using AI or your
Hmm.
calendar or whatever it is, to help you manage those weaknesses so they don't get in the way of your success.
I always think like with true like hard or soft skills, I've always heard of people like you need to like exploit your strengths or keep working on them so you can keep getting better and more specialized. And then I think like I'm a huge NBA fan, so I'm gonna go here. A lot of those like NBA players, they continue working on the things that they're bad at too, the weaknesses, because those can be exposed and it doesn't make them as good. So they might still be working on their strengths, but they're also working on the things they're not so good at. And I'm
Right.
curious, like, which should get more attention when you're like
Yeah.
talking about developing skills as a professional. And in the NBA, that's like a whole different, this is the best of the best of the world. What about a regular professional though? Do we work on our weaknesses as much as our
Yeah.
strengths, or is there a balance?
Well, I'm a huge basketball fan too,
Oh,
so
good.
we can go with
You're
this
good company.
analogy. If you remember back in the day, Shaq, right? That's who I grew
Yeah.
up watching. Shaq was great at the things that he was good at. He was a center. He was, really dominant in the paint, and he was terrible at free
Free
throws, right?
throws.
To the extent that some would say, he lost some games because of his free throws or inability to do free throws. And I remember it used to always be a joke, like Shaq's practicing those three free throws, right? But I think it's a good example. Like Shaq did practice his free throws and he got moderately better as time went on, right? But he was never going to be great at
Right.
free throw. That's just not his jam, right? He was great at the things that he was great at. And so if he probably looked at his time, I'm sure he only spent about 30% of his time or less probably on free throws. So he focused on it in a way that it hopefully wouldn't keep them from a championship, right? Because
Hmm.
that would be the worst thing. But Shaq was never going to be the person that you want on the free throw line. Like that just wasn't, his strength. And so I think that relates to how we show up in the workplace, right? You got to focus on it enough for it to not get in the way of your success. But if you spend all your time trying to be good at free throws or that thing that you're just not naturally skilled at, you'll actually never be as good at that person as that person who is naturally skilled at that thing, right? And so, for example, if public speaking is not a strength of yours, you should get some comfort in public speaking, especially if that's part of your job, so that you don't get so nervous or you don't, drop the ball if your team needs you to do this public speaking thing. However, you are never going to be, Barack Obama when it comes to your oration. Like that's
Right.
just probably not going to happen. It's not a natural gift of yours, and that's okay. You have other gifts, right? And so, focusing on it on to the extent that you need to and help you manage that weakness is necessary, but don't spend too much time, on
Hmm.
those free throws or on that thing that you're not naturally gifted at, because that is time you could spend on those things that you are naturally gifted at. That and most times you're better than most at that thing because it's one of your natural gifts and abilities.
When I picked up your book, you talk about code switching. I had never heard this concept before, and I don't know if the listeners are familiar with it either. Define that for us, and then maybe give some examples of where this shows up at work.
So there are tons of ways code switching shows up at work. Code switching at its core is changing some part of yourself to downplay your identity in order to fit into the environment that you're in. Usually it's for the comfort of the dominant group, whatever that group
Mm.
is, right? So in the workplace, we see this with women, for example, downplaying maybe their feminine characteristics, downplaying maybe the fact they have children, et cetera, in order to fit in, let's say, with a more dominant male culture. That is one example. But it could be those everyday things that you do, like how you wear your hair or the clothes
Mm.
that you wear. I've even heard people say, I downplay my accent at work because I don't want people to automatically
Oh.
pick up that I'm not from this country. And I've gotten feedback, maybe from a client or whomever, that, it's hard for them to understand me. And so I downplay those parts of my identity. And the research on code switching is really, really clear that people do it because it is a navigation technique. And for many people, it does help them advance. There's clear research that, when you code switch things like your name or your accent or what have you, you are more likely to get a job, especially in an environment that is white and male dominated, right? However, the research is also really clear that code switching comes at a cost. It comes
Mm.
at a psychological burden, and sometimes even a physical burden increases stress and anxiety and burnout in the workplace because it's psychologically taxing to shift who you are in order to meet other people's comfort, right? And, code switching is different than, let's say, just showing up, quote unquote, professionally, right? Like having your professional hat on versus, your social hat. What we're talking about in code switching is significantly downplaying who you are and part of your identity for the comfort of other people.
Oh,
And that just doesn't feel good to anyone.
right. Yeah, I had a follow-up question to that. Is it good or bad? And it really just sounds like because it's for the comfort of somebody else. It's not good.
Well, it's interesting. I do think code switching gets a bad rap in some ways, and I'll explain. So, I do think that when you're code switching to make someone else feel comfortable and downplaying things that are central to your identity,
Yeah.
that is a negative thing, right?
Hmm.
However, when we think about some things that we do, and I like to use the example of how we dress, right? How we dress is actually code switching in the workplace. It's a version of it, right? And so if I'm dressing in a suit, in order to be taken seriously by this, group of stakeholders that I know will only take me seriously if I have on a suit, to me that is a element of code switching that I am personally okay with. It's in the eye of the beholder, right? Someone else may not be comfortable with that. And they're like, if I can't wear whatever my athleisure wear for this board meeting, then that's not the board meeting for me. And I get that. And I think that's a good choice to make for you. For me, when I think about code switching, I want people to be informed about what they're doing. So a lot of folks that, have been code switching all their lives, one didn't even have a terminology for it,
Yeah.
right? And so one is understanding like there's this thing that I'm doing and I want to be aware that I'm doing it so I can decide, do I want to keep doing it? Or is this something I'm actually not comfortable? It makes me feel bad. It frustrates me, what have you. And then I need to make a different decision. Maybe I need to lean into my authentic self more, or maybe I need to find another organization. I am not of the belief that there's a one size fits all approach for everyone. I think you have to make an informed decision, but you can only make that decision if you are informed, if you have the language, and if you have the understanding that you're not alone. You're not the only one that's dealt with this. And, Deloitte has some great research on covering. They call it covering, but it's a form of code switching. And their research finds that everybody, code switches in the workplace, even white men, Brandon. Like everyone code switches to some extent. However, unsurprisingly, women and people of color and people in the LGBTQ community code switch more than other groups.
Yeah. Have you been aware of a time you've code switched that maybe you talk about in the book as well?
Absolutely. I mean, how much time do we have?
So yeah, that chapter's pretty deep. So you have a lot of examples, but maybe just like one example of like where you became aware of when you're doing this.
Yeah. So for the listeners, I am a Black female. And so I have spent most of my career in corporate spaces. And oftentimes I have been the only Black person on the team, and often the only Black female on the team, often the only female on the team. So I have experienced that othering in many different regards. And I remember back in my first job that I got some braids in my hair. And I was really excited about the braids because it's a protective style, for those of you who don't know, wearing during the summer.
Yeah.
And I was nervous, though, about going to work for the first day with this new hairstyle. And so I text my mentor at like 6 a.m., which was so inappropriate, but he was so gracious to text me back. It's like, I got this new hairstyle. Is it professional? Should I wear it or should I not? And funny enough, looking back, I had no plan if he said like, no, that's terrible, don't wear it, right? Because braids take many, many hours to put in and many, many hours to take out. So there was actually no plan for me, like maybe calling in sick or something, but there was no plan for me to not wear my hair as such. So anyways, he gave me great encouragement. And I share this because having mentors and sponsors is so critical when you're trying to navigate these spaces, right? So then I get to work, and the partner that worked on my team, he stops by my desk and he says, "Oh, your hair is interesting." And so the hours of agony that I had had previously over wearing this hairstyle, and then that reassurance that I had and confidence that was built from that conversation with my mentor, it was all kind of out the window in that
Totally taken away
one
from you.
second,
Yeah.
right? And so if you just think about it, if you take a step back, I spent X amount of hours thinking about this hairstyle, right? This has nothing to do with my job. I'm reaching out and having conversations about this hairstyle. I get to work and someone comments on this hairstyle. Now I'm thinking about it again for hours. If you can imagine the psychological toll that takes, right? And that's one incident, one day. And think about the magnifying effect of someone who often has these moments, and whether they be microaggressions, whether they be just moments of misunderstanding. I don't think that partner actually meant any negative by their comment. It wasn't positive per se, but I
Yeah.
think they were maybe just surprised because it was different, right? But they didn't understand how that had an impact on me. And so that was an instance where, while I did not code switch, the act of thinking, should I downplay my identity? Should I not wear this hairstyle? That's an example of code switching that, many people have experienced.
In the chapter about be ready, be right, be excellent, you start with a quote from Kobe Bryant. I'm sorry, I'd had to do it again. NBA. Rest in peace, Kobe. That I wanted to share because I think it's super powerful, and then maybe respond to it and how you thought about it throughout that whole chapter, because it's pretty deep stuff. So the quote says, if you want to play at an excellent level, if you want to do something excellent, you have to be excellent all the time. It's a way of life. It's not just how you show up on Monday and be excellent. It doesn't work that way. You have to be excellent across the board. When excellence becomes a habit, that's just who you are. End the quote. So how did you think about what you wrapped? Like, that was the beginning of your chapter, that quote. How did you think about that amongst the content in that chapter?
Yeah, first of all, yes, rest in peace, Kobe. He was such, and still is for me, an inspiration of hard work, passion, of never settling for less than his best, right?
Right.
In so many levels, right? And for me, this chapter is all about defining your own level of excellence. It stems back from how I grew up. My mom always asked me if I did my best on whatever it is. So, like, if I got a B on the test, it was never, did you get a B and that's bad, or what have you. It was, did you do your best?
Mm-hmm.
And I always knew on the inside if I studied enough or if I didn't, right? If I knew I studied my behind off, then it was like, yeah, I did my best and there was nothing to feel bad about. Like, maybe we need some mitigation strategies, right? If I got a really bad grade on something, again, to not keep me from success, manage that weakness, right? But if I didn't try my best, that was that internal conversation I had to have, and that's what I still to this day have often if I'm evaluating my performance. And so, when I think about be ready, be right, be excellent, it's not about other people's metrics of success. You can use their metrics of success to inform, what's good or what's great in your industry or job. But what I'm really talking about is that Kobe Bryant quote of, like, when you are at your best. You know how many hours of sleep you need to show up at your best. You know what time you need to leave the house in order to get there on time and not, like, have any, mistakes happen. You know how often you need to practice that presentation for you to feel really comfortable, right? All of those things, especially the longer that you work and just the more you get to know yourself, you know what it means to show up at your best, at your level of excellence, and having that as your barometer of how you show up is critically important. And I like to make the distinction that it's not other people's metrics of success, because especially for people marginalized identities or historically marginalized identities, there's often this sense that you have to be, to someone else's standard, right? Or what you do is never going to be good enough. I talk in the book about, the adage often used, you have to work twice as hard to get half as far. In many communities, that's something I grew up in the Black community hearing, but many communities have variations of that same saying, because we know that oftentimes the playing field isn't even, right? And you do have to work a bit harder. But it's not just about that, right? It's not about other people acknowledging. We hope they do. And we hope that we're in environments that are equitable and inclusive. But the reality is that only you can hold yourself to that standard of excellence. And I find that when you are able to do that, and when you marry that with leaning into your strengths, you really can go really far in your career.
I pulled out a quote, and I can't remember if it was from this chapter or another one, but it seems so multi-layered, and I want you to unpack it for me. You said doing your job only gets you so far. What did you mean by that?
Oh, that's a tough lesson I had to learn many times over. So, when you see the world as a meritocracy, which we all hope and
Yeah, we
wish
hope.
the world was, but the reality is that many times it's not, right? It's who you know, it's what you know, it's how you make those connections, it's getting in front of the right people, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on. But oftentimes we think about just what's in front of us. Like, for example, you are to make 10 sales a week, right? Okay, great. So you make the 10 sales. You're like, okay, I did my job. That should be good enough. And in many organizations, the unspoken rule is that you got to do more than that. So maybe you need to be making, additional connections to make 20 sales next week. Or maybe that 10 sales a week is great for your current role, but it's not going to get you to that next level. Even if the standard that's written says 10 sales a week, we know there's always something else behind it. There's another layer, right? And so when we think about just doing our job, we have to think about what the company values, what our manager values, what the organization values. And I'm in no way advocating doing work for free or without compensation. What I'm advocating for is being strategic
Hmm.
about what you do. So, for me early in my career, I always thought that networking was like an extra thing. I was like, oh, this not part of my job. My job is like whatever, it says on my contract. And now, through lived experience and many years of research, it's so critically clear, right? That like networking is part of the job. It is part of how you navigate internally and externally in your career. And so if you think about things like networking or having lunch with that colleague or getting a coffee with someone, as that's extra, you're going to miss out on a lot of opportunities. And it's something that I wish that we talked about a lot more, a lot earlier in career trajectories, so that people don't have to learn the hard way like I did and so many other folks have as well.
I'm glad you brought that up because my next question for you is going to be, what about the people who are super anxious? And I mean, the last few years of the pandemic and remote work and hybrid stuff, it's hurt people. I think in this area of like networking, and just the opportunities weren't there for a lot of people. So, what advice do you have for somebody who is just really hesitant and nervous and just quite frankly, dreads it? There's times that I dread it, but I'm glad I do it after I'm done with it. I'm sure you feel the same way.
Absolutely. And I mean, I can't say that I actually like traditional networking
No.
even to this day. So I remember I started my career on Wall Street, and we used to have these huge networking events like happy hours. And it was like they bring you into a big room and it's like all these leaders and executives, and it was supposed to be like great exposure. I literally could not wait until those things were over, right? It just didn't feel comfortable. It
Yeah.
felt inauthentic. It was just
Hmm.
like, what are we actually talking about? So I get it. So for anybody feeling that, I feel you have some community here with me. However, what I have learned is, what you're really doing in networking is prioritizing the human connection. And so if you take a step back and not think about like how many emails you can get at this event or how many people can you connect with on LinkedIn, and think about how can I actually make meaningful human connections even in this hybrid world, it shifts the mindset a bit, at least for me. And so for me, I think about, again, leaning into my strengths. What are the things I'm really good at? Well, I have high individualization. And so, Brandon, the next time that I see something with Kobe Bryant come across my desk, I'll remember that you really like Kobe. And maybe I'll send you an email saying, hey, Brandon, did you see this article on Kobe Bryant? Right? That is actually networking. That is
Yeah.
keeping the connection alive. That's networking. And that's something that's authentic to me, reading articles and sending them and that type of thing. For other people, it's something else. It's like remembering what your kids like to do on the weekends, or, where you traveled to recently. I encourage people to think about what are those moments that you organically, like the conversation, that you connect with the person or can find connection, and leaning into those as opposed to a cookie cutter, Brandon, it was nice to meet you. I hope we can stay in touch.
Yeah.
And this really feels, inauthentic for both of us.
Yep. I love that. Well, Dr. Ella, there's so much we didn't even get to in your book. It's packed with a lot of great advice for people. But if there's like one concept that you want to leave people with that maybe we didn't touch on, or maybe we did, that you want to leave people with just for their own development and growth professionally, what would that be?
So I think one of my favorite chapters, of course, they're all my favorite, but one of my favorite chapters is around finding your niche. And it's one of the later chapters in the book because in order to find your niche, you really do have to have a strong sense of your strength. You have to have a strong sense of your goals. You have to do some of those other skills I talk about earlier in the book. But as you kind of move throughout your career, it's important for you to find ways to craft your own unique niche in the organization. What's that thing that you bring to the organization that no one else does? And by the way, if you're leaning into your niche, you should be connected with your strengths, meaning it's that thing that you likely do naturally or without too much, hesitation. And so understanding what's important to the organization and understanding what's important to you as well and finding ways to marry that is so important. I'll give you an example from my book. So interviewed this gentleman, Omar, and he had a goal of networking with the C-suite in his organization, getting more exposure there, right? He actually said, I wanted the C team to know my name. And I was like, wow, that's a really audacious goal, but go for it, right? And so he has a skill in podcasting. And so he has a podcast like yourself. And he recognized that the organization was really struggling to bring in the Gen Zers and the younger generation in their organization. They were really like failing to make connections. A lot of people were actually leaving. They felt like they didn't understand what the organization was about. They felt like they didn't have access to any of the senior leadership, et cetera. So what he did, he actually created this vlog, so this video podcast, and where he interviewed all of the senior leadership team. And cool. It went viral in the company. And it was on their internal website, on their social media. It made the executives feel much more accessible to the organization, especially the younger generation of employees. And it helped get his goal accomplished of, as he said it, the C team knows his name, right? And so in that example, which I just absolutely love, it's not just about doing things to contort yourself to an organizational environment that, you're not trying to be in or doesn't serve you, right? It's about thinking, what are my goals professionally and even personally, if it's relevant? What does the organization value and what can I bring that's unique in both of those spaces? And so this takes time. Most people don't just wake up overnight like, oh, this is my niche, I got it. It takes time, it takes some trial and error. But I find that people who get the most from their careers are the ones that have found that unique space for themselves and are aligned with organizations that also value that unique niche.
Well, your book is out. It's called Unspoken, A Guide to Cracking the Hidden Corporate Code. Dr. Ella Washington, thank you so much for coming on the show. Where can people connect with you, learn more about any of your work, and obviously go get this book?
Absolutely. Please connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd love to connect with you. I'm super active, Ella F. Washington on LinkedIn. And visit my website to find out all about my work, ellafwashington.com.
My guest today has been Dr. Ella Washington. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.